good morning, everyone. Our topic for today's discussion is about the stages in child language acquisition. Allow me to introduce my co-presenters for today's discussion. We have here Miss Concha, Miss Doñes, Miss Muñoz, Miss Vicente, and yours truly, Miss Carael. But now, let us proceed to our intended learning outcomes. At the end of the discussion, learners must attain the following learning outcomes. First is to define language acquisition. Second is to recognize acquisition and learning. Third is to differentiate nature versus nurture. And lastly, identify the different stages in child language acquisition. But before we move on to our proper discussion, let us have our motivational activity called Word Trip. So the mechanics of this game is facilitators will provide a word. Students have to form new words from the letters of the given word. This game will test and improve students' vocabulary. So, in order for you to understand how this will work, let us look into our example. So, we have here the word wonderful. So, in the word wonderful, we created or listed new words. We have here the word world, wonder, lower, under, flower, fuel, rule or ruler, and found. So, you can type your answers on the comment section so we can read it. So, are you guys ready? Okay, let's start. For our first word, we have holophrastic. So, you may pause the video and type your answers on the comment section. For our second word, we have telegraphic. And for our last word, we have development. Thank you for participating. Now let's move on to our discussion. So, language acquisition is an instinct triggered by birth. So, language acquisition is an instinct triggered by birth, meaning it is an intentional process. When acquiring a language, you learn without any formal instruction, and you may not even be aware that you are learning it. Constant communication is what makes learning language easier. It is a rapid it is very rapid as it only requires a short amount of time for a child to develop language. Children learn a language not because they have an innate ability that allows them to acquire a speech at an early stage in their development, such as exposure to different cultures and influences from their environment. Stages in acquiring language are going stage, the bubbling stage, the holoplastic stage, and the two-word stage, and the telegraphic stage, which will be further explained by Ms. Muñoz as we continue with the discussion. So, for the next presenter, Ms. Concha will now present the language acquisition.
All right, thank you, Miss Aslie. Language acquisition, according to Chomsky 2009, it is a matter of growth and maturation of relatively fixed capacities under appropriate external conditions. When we say growth, it is physical and quantifiable process in development. An example is a change in the height. You get physically taller or and is measurable. On the other hand, maturation is the development of individual and behavioral characteristics through growth. So, different children proceed through these stages at different rates. As children become mature and grow, their capacity under appropriate external conditions increases to language learning and acquisition. Children perceive and produce speech sounds. They babble, usually with a consonant, then babble pattern. They speak out first basic words. They grow our vocabularies, learning to classify things, then build two-word sentences, and then increase the complexity of their sentence. Thus, language is a matter of growth and maturation of relatively fixed capacities under appropriate external conditions. And according to Varsity 2003, it is the process whereby children achieve fluent control of their native language. So it is the ability to get and understand the language is inherited genetically, but the particular language that children speak is culturally and environmentally transmitted to them. Children all over the world acquire their first language without tutoring, whereas a child exposed to speak to an English-speaking community begin to speak English fluently. The other one is exposed to a community of Indonesian speakers begin to use Indonesian fluently. So, like for example, my native language is Filipino, or I used to live with Filipino speaker. I am exposed to them, so I begin to use Filipino fluently. So it is the ability to get and understand the language is inherited genetically, but particular language um that children speak culturally and environmentally transmitted to them. All right. Next. Um the difference between acquisition and learning, when we say acquisition, like for example, they're walking. So we know that walking is a process of acquisition. All children are able to walk without any instruction and tutoring, or no one teaches them to walk. Or another example is your L1, your native language. You earn it from birth. So it is a process of acquisition. When we say learning, it is like for example, the reading. Reading is a learning process because he or she is taught to read so that he or she is able to read. As we know, many people all over the world are not able to read because they aren't taught to do so. And another example is your L2. It is your personal choice. It is learned through guidance and instruction. So that's the difference. Next, may I call in Miss Ivy? Thank you.
All right, let's move on to nature versus nurture. So now, where did the phrase nature versus nurture came from? The phrase nature versus nurture came from was first coined in the mid 1800s by the English Victorian polymath Francis Galton in discussion about the influence of heredity and environment on social advancement. Next po. So how does heredity and environment influence each other? Just a quick recap about it. Genes determine your behavior in other situations, while environment plays a larger role in influencing your behavior. Now let's move on to nature. So nature mostly refers to our genetic structure. It contains the genes we inherit from our parents as well as additional genetic traits that may have an impact on how our personalities are formed and how we grow from childhood to maturity. So examples of biologically determined traits are like eye color, hair color, and your skin tone. Next. Now, nurture. Environmental influences on our personalities are included in nurture. This encompasses our early experiences, how we are raised, our social connections, and the culture around us. Other traits are influenced by one's environment, such as person's behavior, which can be influenced by one's upbringing and life experiences. For example, one child might learn through observation and enforcement to say please and thank you. Another child might learn to behave aggressively by observing other children engage in violent behavior on the playground. So, most experts recognize that neither nature nor nurture is stronger than the other. Instead, both factors play a critical role in who we are and who we become. Not only that, but nature and nurture interact with each other in important ways all throughout our lifespan. Now, this is where the interaction between nature and nurture comes in. Next po. All right. Um, the interaction between heredity and environment. Many researchers consider the interaction between heredity and environment, nature with nurture, as opposed to nature versus nurture, to be the most important influencing factor of all. So, height is an example of a trait influenced by an interaction between nature and nurture. A child might inherit the genes for height. However, if they grow up in a deprived environment where proper nourishment isn't received, they might never attain the height they could have had if they had grown up in a healthier environment. So in this part, some of our characteristics that are biologically determined, but it could also be influenced by the environmental factors. So this is where the nature and nurture interacts. Next po. Now, nature versus nurture in child development. Some psychological theories of child development place more emphasis on nurture and other focuses more on nurture. Now, in nature, an example of a nativist theory involving child development in Chomsky's concept of language acquisition device, or LAD. According to this theory, all children are born with an instinctive rather mental capacity that allows them to both learn and produce language. So children are naturally able to recognize the rules of language, which makes learning a native language simple for them. They think that children have linguistic skills rather, that help them as they strive to become fluent in a language. Next is in nurture. Albert Bandura's social learning theory is an illustration of an empirically based child development theory. So, according to this notion, people pick up new skills through seeing how others behave. In his well known experiment with the Bobo doll, Bandura showed how children could pick up aggressive traits only by watching an aggressive adult. So, this social learning theory goes beyond the common belief that learning occurs as a direct result of interaction with the environment by proposing that observation and modeling plays a major role in how and why individuals learn. So, in conclusion, in nature versus nurture, when it comes to language acquisition, according to research, people first have to have the ability to learn language or nature rather. And then when they are able and in a language environment, which is nurture, they can begin to speak it after a long period of listening and speaking training. Just like Chomsky said, children are born with a language acquisition device or LAD, which allows them to have the ability to acquire language and use grammar. This is a prerequisite for children to develop language skills. Then, as Skinner said, children need to be immersed in a language environment, which means that their parents needs to speak and interact with them. This is how the children language acquisition device or LAD can begin to come in handy. Bilingual speakers whose parents are speak a different language will begin to imitate two different languages in their innate environment. From there, they continue to work on their ability to speak both languages as they grew up. And then they will gradually begin to become proficient in both languages as they grow up. Even deaf children have ability to create their own language so that they can communicate with others. Both innate and acquired play an important role in language development. Parents and the people around the child interact with the child linguistically during early development, and language functions are gradually established during this interaction, and their ability to acquire language is continuously developed over time. Eventually, they become proficient in one or more languages. And now let's move on to the next topic, which will be discussed by Miss Margie.
Next page po. So for stages in first language acquisition, for the first stage, next page, or the pre-birth, it is the preparation of the human brain for language acquisition. Here, the child ear starts to function at third trimester of pregnancy. That's why once the baby is born, it's already familiar with speech and language. Here, it can also discriminate speech sounds from non-speech sounds. Non-speech sounds like sneezing and lip smacks. They are liable more to their native language since it is what they hear while inside the womb of their mother and can distinguish clearly between their mother voice and other voices. Next page. Next stage is babbling. It is the sound that infants produce consonant-vowel combinations. At this stage, parents should expect their children to go through three phases. First is the one consonant and a vowel at a time. For example, ma, pa, la, or lo. Next is the reduplicative babbling. For example, ma, 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 ma. Lastly, the non-reduplicative babbling. For example, me, ma, or mami. For you to clearly understand what babbling is to a child, we have here an example video. Okay, right? For the next page. For the next stage is one word or holophrastic stage. During this stage, a child uses single word construction to communicate. The first single word which represents a sentence and one word to express a particular emotion. An example for this is the child is asking for a water, it will say nom. Or when it comes to naming objects, for example, it's a dog. The baby will say chu, chu. Next page. Next stage is the two-word stage. At this stage, lots of verbs, nouns, adjectives, and intonation emerge. The baby begins to show off their understanding of the word order used in their language. For example, the toddler will say, Tommy, play. It's a doer plus action. Another example for refusal is the toddler will say, no water. It doesn't want water. So for the next stage,
can you say daddy? Can you say can you say thank you? Can you say me? Can you say
so the next stage is telegraphic stage. During this stage, the child will mostly use content words such as verbs, nouns, adjectives, and some pronouns such as me and mine. They start to make longer than two-word utterances that appear to be sentence-like, resembling those sentences structures created by adults. For example, the child will now say, want more ice cream than want ice cream. It's an example video for telegraphic.
what's your favorite color? What's your favorite food?
The last stage is the multi-word stage. At this stage, a complete sentence begins to emerge. By 3 years old, they begin to use more grammatical words such as plural, preposition, etc. Imperative and declarative sentences also appear. Here, the child now have a wide range of vocabulary. There's no babbling anymore, and utterances have communicative intent. For example, for imperative or command, the child will say, give me my ball. For declarative or relay information, it will say, that's my ball. Here's another example for this stage.
Once upon a time, I was walking in the jungle, and I stopped. And when I stopped, I just heard two snapping glitches. But then I knew I was surrounded with
So that's all for stages in first language acquisition. Now, let's have the next presenter.
All right, thank you, Miss Muñoz. Now that we already know the process of how children acquire the ability to communicate verbally, let's find out how we can help them improve their language development. So here are the 5 tips for improving language development. The first tip is to read books aloud. So reading books aloud to children can help them learn new words and sentence structures which will improve their language learning skills. So as teachers, we can apply this tip by scheduling book reading sessions with them, and with that we can test their language abilities. The second tip is to converse regularly. It is another useful technique for improving their language skills. Even though toddlers usually cannot respond when they hear certain words or um, statement frequently, it will be easier for them to reproduce those words later. And the third one is to give adequate support and encouragement. So as more knowledgeable ones, we are not just there to guide them, but also to encourage and support them throughout the language development process, because it will also help them to learn at a faster pace, while improving their confidence in speaking at the same time. So when they make mistakes, of course, for example, in pronunciation or grammar, of course, consider correcting them encouragingly and not harshly. And the fourth tip is to limit screen time. Based on what I've noticed with parents these days, they just let their kids use gadgets all the time. Well, that can be a tool for to improve their language development. However, it also causes a lack of meaningful interactions. And actually, several studies reveal that educational media directed at toddlers doesn't work. And what works for them is face to face interactions. So, our last tip is to give children control. So, during conversations with them, let let them control the flow of the topic or the discussion, because that can improve their ability to form their own sentences and ideas. Next. Okay. So to wrap it up, the stages of child language acquisition show how children gradually understand basic linguistic patterns until they achieve fluency. And we have to remember that the stages of language acquisition are universal, but each child is different or unique. And so they develop at a different rate. The ability of a child to acquire rather a language can be affected by a variety of factors, including motivation, environment, and physical development. So understanding these stages of language acquisition is important, as it will enable us to establish goals for children and respond to their needs, if they have not attained the proper milestone for their age. Therefore, following the tips of for improving a child's language development is recommended to ensure that every child can communicate their ideas and feelings, which will help them build and maintain relationships. Next slide, please. So I also want to leave you this quotation by Maria Montessori saying, the child has a mind that absorbs knowledge. He has the power to teach himself. Next slide, please. And also, for your assessment, we prepared two questions here, and you can explain your answers in 3 to 5 sentences. And this will be on Google Forms that we will just send later. Next slide, please. And these are our references that you can search for if you want to know more about our topic. Next slide, please. And that's all. Thank you for listening.